Thompson.
Professor John Kenneth Galbraith is an internationally known economist and commentator. He was born in 1908 in Ontario, Canada, but has spent most of his life working in the USA. In addition to teaching and researching in the most distinguished of American universities, he worked for the US government during the Second World War and served as US ambassador to India between 1961 and 63. Professor Galbraith has been a prolific writer, at the last count having published at least 21 books. Perhaps the three best known of these are American Capitalism, The Affluent Society, and his more recent The Culture of Contentment. Professor Galbraith is an example of the classic American liberal and gentleman. I spoke to him in his house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is situated right adjacent to his spiritual home of Harvard University. Professor Galbraith began his main professional activity as an economist in the 1920s, and I asked him what the US economy was like during the Great Depression.
For the world at large, this was a period of dismal, continuing unemployment. Here in the United States, the only safety net was the soup kitchen, the soup line. Well, I remember once I was doing a research project. I did my graduate work in California. And I stayed at a hotel in the center of Los Angeles, and not a particularly run-down part of the city. And coming out in the morning, the impoverished people, as had been sleeping in a nearby park, would come hoping for some money. I didn't have very much money, but the notion that there was all these people dependent on charity, the most vulnerable kind of charity, for their next meal, was one of the saddest recollections I have at that time. And this lasted for 10 full years. There was a sense of human despair there that has been with me ever since.
So did this affect your own intellectual development?
Oh, quite clearly. First, with a sense that the norm in economics, in economic behavior, was not good times and full employment. That made me extremely susceptible to John Maynard Keynes and the notion of an underemployment equilibrium, that in the balancing of savings and investment, this came about not by the reduction of interest rates and capital becoming more available, but by the economy settling down to the point where it forced an equilibrium. This was the heart of the Keynesian idea, very much still under some dispute. It made me and all my generation. And it provided an association between economic behavior and human well-being, human happiness, that I have ever since considered to be very close.
What role did you play in the war?
I think it's fair to say that I was one of the more important administrative figures in World War economic policy. I was effectively the price czar. I was the deputy administrator of the Office of Price Administration in charge of prices. And you could lower a price without my permission in the Republic, but you couldn't raise a price. And that gave me a sense of power that where I have had the feeling that my life has been in decline ever since.
Now, that period when you were effectively the regulator of prices for such a vast economy, did this have any effect on your attitudes and opinions about kind of economics?
Oh, that was a highly educative experience. No question about it. On a whole variety of matters. First, the power of special interest in the Congress. Anybody wanting a better price came to the Congress, and the Congress came to me. I've often told the story, if it were cotton, they came to a Southern legislator whose name was Cotton Ed Smith and appealed for a higher price for cotton. Cotton Ed then got in touch with his son, who happened to be clerk of the committee and who was called Bull Weevil Smith. And Bull Weevil then called me, and I spent the next morning before the Senate Agricultural Committee. Senate Committee on Agriculture and Forestry, it was called. And I had a continuing lesson which has served me very well on the intelligence quotient of the great industrial bureaucrat. If you had in those days spent a whole morning with the heads of the steel industry in the United States, you came away with a certain doubt as to whether we should be making steel or not. They were masters of the uninformed cliche, cited with enormous self-confidence. You asked them for something, and you always got the same answer. Well, you can trust the patriotism of the American businessman. And that patriotism usually involved the feeling that prices should be a little higher than they were. And on a more general economic matter, I became aware at that time of the relationship between macroeconomics, where you controlled the whole flow of aggregate demand, the whole flow of demand in the economy, or influenced it, and saw that as the instrument of policy. And you saw the importance of the wage-price relationship of microeconomics as part of the stabilization process.
But also, presumably, the terrific importance, certainly in the American case, of the large corporation. You subsequently wrote a great deal about that.
I think this is undoubtedly so. The notion of the great corporation, the notion of the bureaucratic attitude, the notion of the power of what I later came to call the technostructure, goes back partly to that time, no question. Although it also goes to two scholars who wrote about that, Burley and Means, Adolph Burley and Gardner Means, who possibly affected my thinking most after John Maynard Keynes, who left the indelible imprint of the role of the 500 largest corporations in the American economy.
Can I just take you to the post-war period now? You mentioned the importance of Keynes in your own thinking. Presumably this was a period of great optimism for you. The long boom was beginning and so on. But on the other hand, it seems to me, this was also the period when you developed your work around the private affluence, public squalor kind of argument thesis. That thesis is a rather pessimistic thesis about the consequences of the long boom. How did you handle this, on the one hand, this optimism, and on the other, the rather pessimistic reaction to it?
There was no problem there. I have to step back a little bit. Like others, I shared, during the war years, a sense of pessimism as to what would happen after the war. We had, as the result of the long period of the Depression in the 1930s, come to believe, with some help from Keynes, that maybe the underemployment equilibrium was normal. And I engaged in a lot of discussions during the war years about how we might correct that in the post-war period. What happened was, of course, that we came out of the war with an enormous reservoir of spendable savings, a very strong supportive aspect to the economy as compared with the 1930s, and the Korean War, which came along as a stimulative influence, and the Marshall Plan, claims on the economy which brought us to relatively full employment and carried us along through the rest of the 1940s and the 1950s. I didn't foresee that, but I welcomed it, and that was part of the basis of my comment in the Affluent Society, where I focused on the two things that weren't fortunate in that period. One was the continuing islands of poverty in our mountain areas in the south and in the central cities, and additionally, the very great difference between our private well-being as it was developing and our public services. The fact that we were getting to the point where we had good radio and television and lousy schools, if I might come home, that we had clean houses and filthy streets, that we were losing control of the visual aspects of our environment. Highways loaded with billboards concealing the landscape. Beautiful verse from that time, which you remember it? I think that I shall never see a billboard lovely as a tree. I think unless the billboards fall, I'll never see a tree at all. There was this incredible disproportion in our well-being that I dealt with in those years.
You've refined that thesis slightly differently to reposition it or rediscuss it around this idea of the culture of contentment. Could you just explain what the culture of contentment is and how it's linked to this public squalor, private affluence thesis?
The culture of contentment, which I've dealt with more recently, is the consolidation of political power in Britain, the United States, in the hands of the most comfortable, contented of the people. It isn't the old-fashioned capitalist. The old dialectic of capital and labor we can put aside. It is no longer central. The modern dialectic is between a large community of businessmen, business bureaucrats, business managers, I should say. I'll be nice. Professional people, academic people, lawyers, physicians, all of whom have a relatively comfortable existence. We have no great complaint about the nature of the modern society, and the people who are outside, the underclass, the people who live south of the Thames in London, the people that live in Harlem, South Bronx in New York, South Central Los Angeles, the people who are, as I say, voiceless in the system, but do a great deal of the work that makes life for the rest of us possible. And it was that dialectic, that conflict, that I sought to deal with, which was emerging in my mind at the time of the Affluent Society, which I've sought to do some work on since.
Could I take us on now to a rather general point in your work, the importance you attribute to money, the financial system, the financial panics and crises? This has been a consistent theme in your work. Why is money and the financial system so important?
Well, there are several answers to that. There's first that we have an exaggerated view of the financial world and the people in it. There is a deep instinct that there is some association between intelligence and money. There's a presumption that where you find money, you find brain power. This means that a magic is attributed to the financial community, which, well, there is no magic. What there is a recurrent tendency to get captured by the speculative mood. That was true in the 1920s. I first became aware of it studying the 1920s and the great crash of 1929. There were speculative episodes in the 50s and 60s, and of course we had in the 1980s the mergers and acquisitions mania, the leveraged buyout insanity, the great real estate speculation, and the tendency to be carried away by the speculative mood, which, as I say, captures the people not with the least money, but with the most very often, is one of the recurring features of the economy, and one that has certainly attracted my attention. To some extent, it's attracted my pleasure. There's something, I've said this many times, there's something nice about great tragedy when nothing is being lost but money.
Do you think the futures markets are just another manifestation of this? This is something that is very current now and developing. Is this another form of this fascination with...
Oh, no question about it. This manifests itself in many forms. Ever since the Dutch in the 17th century went wild on tulips. Somber Dutchmen speculating in tulip bulbs. And the South Sea bubble, which I suppose has some place in British history still, doesn't it? And John Law, Britain's contribution to France. and the recurrent bubbles of the last century and the Japanese speculation of these last years. This is something which is, as I say, part of the system.
It's not just peculiar to America, then?
No. It has one central feature which is always worth remembering. It is that a group of people, presumed to be wise and with money, see a price going up or prices going up. So they see an opportunity and they buy against the possibility that it will go up more. And their buying makes it go up more. And that attracts still more, and forces the price up still more. So there is an internal self-generating influence here, which is the essence, in one form or another, of the speculative bubble. And then eventually, the supply of new buyers runs out. Eventually, the supply of bank credit runs out, and it levels off. People decide to get out, and then comes the crash. The buildup is always somewhat rational in appearance, and the crash always comes very suddenly.
Is there anything in a public policy sort of sense that can be done to meet this, or is it endemic in the system and there's nothing we can do about it?
The word endemic was one I was searching for. I think it is. An understanding of the process is, I think, helpful for individuals to keep out. But no, I think that the speculative mood is an essential feature of the system. And that one of the extraordinary things is that when in the speculative mood, when people are becoming quite insane about real estate values or stock market values, the person who says that there is an element of insanity there is always criticized. He is an inferior sort of person who cannot see the opportunity that exists.
So we're going to have these cycles and troughs. It's a feature that we're going to have to live with. Is that true also of the real economy, if one might put it like that? We've discussed mainly about the financial and monetary economy, but this has an impact on the real economy.
It has an effect on the real economy and has an adverse effect, and we should be prepared for that. But I would not surrender quite so readily on the real economy. I would hope that there might come a time when the economy is strong. We would see the opportunity for conservative budget policy, for balancing the budget, for paying down debt even possibly. And that we would see that when the economy turns sour after one of these speculative episodes, this is not the time to call for restraint, call for cutting down on the budget deficit. That is the time when the government must be a supporting influence. And as I say, I would hope that we might someday reach the mood. I emphasize this very strongly. When we would see that in a period like the 80s, the government should be a restraining factor. And in a period such as the 90s, the government should be a supporting factor. It involves going against the current of the financial mood, but I never sit down to write without hoping that that might be possible.
Are you a naturally optimistic man or are you a pessimistic man?
Nothing, neither. Optimism and pessimism both imply some departure from reality. I want you to think that I'm intensely realistic.